I guess most of you probably realise that I purport to be a bit of an artist as well as a colour maker. Todd and I were just discussing the light in this room as he was setting up, and he commented it's got a nice light. I paint often in this room, but although it's got plenty of light, it does come with its own challenges.
Yeah.
Let alone the fact the light moves around. Of course, it tends to be a predominantly more yellowy orange light. That's my interpretation of it anyway. That way is south, and of course that's where most of the light is coming from.
But you're a painter. I mean, so you went to art school, right?
Yeah.
And then how did you find your way into paint making? I know you've told me the story, but maybe we can start there.
Well, I made the silly mistake of thinking that if I had the right materials, I could paint like Rembrandt, and of course that's only part of it, as we've often discussed.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even 1% of what was really going on. But yeah, I researched the paints that the old guys, as I call them affectionately, used to work with, and thought that it would bring me to be able to paint more closely like Rembrandt. And the key thing, of course, is even if you had the exact tools those guys were working with, that's only a small bit of a big operation, as it were.
Mm.
And yeah, I made paint because I couldn't get the effects that I was looking for and could see in other old master paintings. I'm still working on that, of course. As soon as I made my own colours, my work had a leap forward anyway.
Mm.
And I always say to artists, the closer you can, the more hands-on you can be with your materials, the better.
Yeah.
I advocate, I wish all artists would learn how to grind their own colour. Then you know also how hard it has been for me doing that for you in many cases.
Yeah.
I'm a staunch believer in the more understanding that an artist can have about the handling qualities of their paints and paintings, the better. Right down to stretching your own canvas, things like that. I mean, a lot of you, of course, will sort of balk at the idea of having to do those more sort of menial sort of tasks, but to me they're all important.
Yeah.
If we were carpenters, let's go to the forest and look at the shapes of trees. That's what I advocate. The more understanding you can have of the materials, the greater the ability.
Reminds me of like farm to table, or the whole idea of like gardening, and then bringing that into the restaurant, where you have like a tie to the food.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so you started grinding your own paints, and this was after you graduated from art school.
As I was graduating, literally was the last few weeks, and it's a shame it didn't happen 3 years before. But make no mistake, I was the most unprolific student you probably could ever come across, and I think I came into art college as the typical young optimistic artist, and suddenly became an average-sized fish in a small fish in a very large pond. Whereas, of course, like most of us, we'd come from, when you display talent as a young artist, you tend to be the only guy around who can do that stuff out of your class at school and that sort of stuff. And then suddenly you're amongst many people who've got similar or greater ability than oneself.
So that was definitely abnormal at the time, right? There was Winsor Newton and a handful of other manufacturers that were making paint.
Yeah, the big names, one of course of which you've quoted, still very well known as a household name today. But there were far less choices in those days.
Yeah.
You'd be hard pushed to find more than 2 brands of oil paint available in the UK.
Mm.
Certainly in the mainstream stores. Whereas today, with the likes of some of the big mail order entities like, say, Jackson's, for instance, who I'd say off the top of my head, Jackson's are probably carrying probably in excess of a dozen lines of oils from all over the world, and that's one of the many advantages, of course, about how the commercial world has changed with the internet.
So you were kind of like making them for yourself, right?
Essentially, initially, yes.
How did it turn into like your friends got wind of it and they were just excited? Or?
Well, I think first of all they noticed that something had changed with my painting. Of course, they asked what I was doing, what had happened, and of course, a certain amount of pride in me was like, oh, I'm making my own paints now. And they, of course, immediately said, "Oh, wow, can we try them as well?" And indeed, they found that they were getting positive changes on their canvases as well. And then, of course, I had this idea. Well, rather than getting work, waiting tables or bar work, whatever it was going to be, like most impoverished artists, until you get discovered, I thought, well, maybe I can be making a bit of paint just simply selling it to my friends, and it just snowballed from there. And I don't know, it would be impossible to guess now how many, perhaps hundreds of thousands of artists we supply on a yearly basis. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a beautiful story, and you've come so far. When I talk to my students and I'm talking about Michael Harding paint, first of all, it's probably weird to even hear your name all the time mentioned, right? I guess you're probably past that point.
Yeah, I'm sort of a bit numb to it now. Sometimes I think, oh my goodness, I've created a monster. What have I done? I remember many years ago, I went into a store and asked for Michael Harding paints. It was a store that I'd supplied, and I just wanted to see what their reaction was going to be, and they didn't recognise me, and that was strange, asking for a product with my own name on.
Yeah. Can I see some ID for that, please?
Yeah, it could have been like that, couldn't it? I don't think about those things at all now. It's just the last thing on my mind. I think I got a kick out of it a few times years ago, where I'd go somewhere and say who I was, and they'd heard my name before, and there was
You're the Michael Harding.
Yeah, and I but that was short lived. I mean, when you're filthy dirty up to your elbows in paint, and it's a Friday evening and you're tired, it's been a long week, and you've got phthalocyanine green all over your neck because the pigment's dusty. It doesn't seem so romantic at that point, I promise you.
So how did it progress as a company? Like, when did you start to, did you put it in stores and,
Yes and no. I mean, we had a couple of starts and stops to the business. And the first time around, I made some silly decisions because I knew nothing about business. And I first started selling paint commercially probably in about somewhere around 1982 to 83 to 84, so just on 40 years ago. And as I say, I didn't know anything about business, so I made a mess of it the first time around, and I quit. I got back in again in the early 90s, and fortunately, I made some good decisions and made some good friends with a particular company called Atlantis in London, who got a huge art store, and the owners of Atlantis were very kind in sharing my vision and supporting me, and gave me, if you like, an area, a platform from which I could relaunch myself, and that's when a lot of the big names came along, like Hockney and Hodgkin and
Freud, right? Lucian Freud.
I met Lucian Freud only once, actually. People tell me that he used my colours after that, but he was a very very private guy. So I don't know. I gave him some lapis and I think some vermilion, and he just smiled and nodded, and I never had any more communication with him again. But people tell me they'd seen evidence of him using the paint. I have no idea. Whereas David Hockney, of course, he's taken bucket loads for a long time. All the Grand Canyons were all cadmium orange that he did. That series was back in the 90s, and then when he did his big tree series in the 2000s, we were sending him lots of paint through Atlantis, the store.
Am I right in Damien Hirst as well?
Damien Hirst, I believe, uses some now. Yeah.
That's some really big names in the market.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, Todd. I don't think about it anymore like that. I mean, even if a person's completely unknown, and as I always jokingly say, you could be a kitten painter painting little kittens on a cushion down in Cornwall in England, I still take those artists as seriously as I do those big names with work in the Tate and places like that. I feel that I have a responsibility to all artists. If someone's trusting enough to invest in a tube of my paint, then I there's a reason why my name's on the tube. I stand by each tube, quite literally.
Yeah.
I remember when I started the business and I was telling people that I was going to put my name on it, quite a lot of people said, look, if I can give you some business advice, that's a bad thing to do, because if something goes wrong, they'll hunt you down. And I look at it another way around. No, I think if anything, they'll hunt you out, because if anyone's bold enough and brave enough and honest enough to put their name on it, it's like standing by the flag, isn't it? It's what you pledge your allegiance to. And I stand by every tube, quite literally.
Yeah.
I don't please all the artists all the time. I mean, we occasionally get complaints from people who a painting hasn't worked out in the way an artist wanted, but even then I go out of my way to try and help an artist. And a lot of the time, of course, it's about educating them, as you know, Todd. You can't just turn up and start painting and expect it to come out of the hat like it's...
Yeah.
There's more to it. I mean, you have to understand those materials.
Yeah, paint is a component of it,
Yeah.
and having really good materials is part of it. But the conceptualization and the eye of the painter, we were chatting earlier about that, is a part of it as well. When I talk about your paints, definitely with my students, I'm always like, the upper echelon of paint manufacturers is you. And
thank you.
A lot of pride in your work, and every time I talk to you, you're proud of where you're at. The product is excellent. I love the story even that you, who is the person that does the painting of the swatches that gets wrapped around?
Oh, we've got a team of guys who do that. They all take turns.
But you could easily just print that off, but you don't. You want to give the audience...
Oh no, just to sort of make people aware of what Todd's talking about. The little colour strip on each tube? That's actually real paint wrapped around every tube. We should have had a few lying around here so I could point to them. We do that for the one very, very good reason. It means that you guys can see exactly what you're getting. A printed colour, as Todd said, I could get them printed. The colour wouldn't be exact. And why not? It's a very, very hands-on material, quite literally, as you would have just heard. And I think the more things you can do like that in this rapidly more and more becoming synthetic world that we live in, I think it's, we try and keep things real.
Yeah,
that's the whole point.
Well, and the attention to detail too. As a teacher, I'm always talking about how to relabel, and some of the clearest labels are yours. You're putting the CIN number on there. You're putting the light fastness. You're putting even a couple things like the oil content, high or low or moderate, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're there for a reason. It helps. Some of you will be thinking, well, why should it make a difference? Some of you will just be painting, that's fine. However, generally, the more artists get involved and immersed into the understanding of the material, they start asking questions. And for instance, the chemistry of the paint. Why is one colour different from another, or one brand different from another brand? And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I deliberately put things on the label to arouse curiosity, like the very long-winded pigment names like phthalocyanine, which can hardly be said by most people, let alone spelt, PHTH, etc., etc. Phthalocyanine, and that is a trade identity really of a certain family of pigments which are very, very light, fast, very, very powerful, a real gift to artists. And you're thinking, what is the meaning of that word? And that's deliberately designed to arouse curiosity, whereas other makers might use their own name, like that would be Harding Green or Harding Blue.
Yeah.
I don't do that.
Or permanent green, you see a lot, or permanent blue.
You got my name on the top of all the tubes anyway.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be there again. So to call it sort of Harding Green would just be overkill. And I can't claim the what's the word? Credit for inventing that pigment. We buy that pigment and make it into paint, and we try and do that very, very well.
Yeah. Which is a cyan, right?
It is phthalocyanine.
Yeah, I actually say that a lot to remind everyone that it's in the cyan family.
Yeah.
And I believe when you put it on, is it aluminum or copper, is when it's going to shift towards green or blue.
It's chlorinated copper.
Chlorinated copper.
And then you can have the brominated chlorinated copper, which is the warmer shade. And I know when we start talking about yellow shade or blue shade greens, it starts to be a bit confusing for the newcomers. But if you saw these two shades of phthalocyanine green next to each other, one would be colder, more sort of bottly green, more bluer, therefore. And then the other shade is what we call a warmer shade of yellow.
Yeah.
And that's the brominated version. So a lot of this, I'm no chemist, but of course there are plenty of fantastic chemists who work in the pigment industry who are doing all this. They're the guys who do the really clever bit. All I am is a glorified mixer. And I can't claim credit for all of that.
Well, that actually brings us to a thing that we've talked about a lot in the past. We've talked about, clarity of labels, the CIN number being one of them, color index name and number, artist creation, in both a website that you and I frequent a lot, full of good, useful information.
Yeah.
As a paint maker, when you go into the paint or pigment house, I guess you could call it, or
they tend to come to me actually. It's not a Mohammed to the mountain thing. It's simply pigment companies are the big customers for a pigment company are the automotive industry. You think where artist colours is a very, very small part of a very, very large industry.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look around any room, you'll see that there are pigment choices and anything from the dye on this wood, the colour of those bottles, to the ceramic here, the pigment in there. So the pigment industry is vast, and of course, as no surprise to most people, the automotive industry is one of the major drivers of. Not sorry about the pun, but is one of the obvious driving forces of the industry, because that's where the big spend is. We are just such an infinitesimally small part of it.
Yeah. That's
sadly also why we tend to lose a lot of historic pigments, because, who would want a Ferrari painted with vermilion?
Yeah.
There'd be no point. And so, obscure historic pigments slowly fall out of use, and we try and keep those going as much as we can, to the point of sometimes making them ourselves in the case of the lead white. And as Todd and I were talking earlier on, because we're both great vermilion fans, I have made vermilion as well, although I've never commercially sold it, combining sulfur and mercury together and various other little things you can do. So I've actually made vermilion.
Yeah. Well, we were chatting too that, when the one I think both of us referenced, and when I came to you when I was writing the Oil Painter's Color Handbook, and I said, I want to make sure that I'm factually straight in the information I'm putting forward, and you and Karen, your wife, definitely helped out in writing that chapter.
Oh, yeah.
And I gave you the draft, and you made a ton of notes, and we crafted that thing together.
Yeah.
Vermilion is one of those colors. I remember one of the things that you had said in there, and it was, once it gets past a certain degree, you're referred to Mayer, right? Ralph Mayer.
By coincidence, happens to be that sitting here, and I mean,
there it is.
That for you guys there, along with Todd's book. These are books that every artist should have around them, and this is the book I got started with paint making. There's I think it's from chapter 3. Let me just have section 3, oil painting. Every artist should read that along with Todd's book. That's all you need. Just 3 or 4 chapters from there, and not the whole thing, just a small section of that.
Thank you.
But Todd, you should have one of your books here in front of us, Todd, as well.
We'll grab one on break.
Yeah.
But the idea is just that, even what Mayer is saying, and he was a chemist, right?
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure, was that there's a uniqueness to vermilion. And as you and I were chatting about the Zorn palette and how cadmium red.
True Zorn palette is vermilion, not cadmium.
Yeah, and there's a total difference as a paint manufacturer. You know it.
Oh, totally. I mean, vermilion for me is a wonderful pigment. It handles in a wonderful way. Plus also, and it doesn't matter. I mean, when we talk about mixing flesh tones, of course, we're predominantly talking about Caucasian flesh tones. because they tend to be obviously lighter and more pinky, and hence the conversation around vermilion.
Hmm.
Um, it does. It just almost paints itself. It makes life easier. I mean, I always say to artists, make the task easy for yourself. Don't make it harder than it needs to be.
Yeah.
You know, that's why it's, I think, always good to set up your materials and understand the materials so that they are your friends. They're going to help you.
Yeah.
If you don't understand them, they're going to hinder you. And for instance, if you were trying to, if you were trying to recreate a Zorn sort of look, palette, whatever you like to call it, as Todd, you say, it's obvious you get as close as you can to the real thing. Just because something's got the word red on it doesn't mean it's going to handle it in exactly the same way as another colour.
Well, naphthol or P-roll or
quite.
cadmium. And this is actually one of the things I showed with like Instagram videos. I took I think it was naphthol red, which is nearly identical to like a cadmium red medium. And then I took that with cobalt teal and I mixed it with both down into it. You could see one of it gave, the exact same color on the other side of the wheel to think that you're going to neutralize it, but each of them gave unique different mixing paths.
Yes. Yeah, they will.
Which is really the point that I try to make when we're, you can see that there's some marketing campaigns with some companies that are cadmium free or all this stuff, and you're just like, you can't replace vermilion. There are reasons why they've done it, but
yeah, I mean, there is a marketing campaign that's been going on recently about somehow as if it's a virtue to have certain colours which are cadmium free. Well, why would you? Because cadmium pigments do their job wonderfully. And people then talk about the toxicity. Cadmium pigments are not toxic, certainly when they're encapsulated within oil. As I understand it, the body doesn't have chemistry to separate the cadmium out. However, if you burn it and inhale it, that's a different matter.
which you shouldn't be eating anyway.
You shouldn't be smoking in your studio with paint on your fingers that gets on the side of the cigarette. But coming back to the toxicity, I mean, as I've just been sitting, I've been thinking about some of the things that artists can get very confused, and they have selective listening, if you like. They'll listen to little bits that appeal to their thought at the time they've sort of been looking for. And I mean, I remember doing a workshop in Australia several years ago, and I had a person sitting in front of me, and they were saying that they wanted to talk about toxicity, and they then said, well, I always wear those nitrile gloves when I'm painting, so the pigment can't get through my skin. And then I noticed that they had tattoos all the way up their arms. And I felt like saying, oh, so you're worried about the pigment getting into your skin rather like a tattoo?
Yeah, which is in your bloodstream.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been reading stuff recently, actually, because this interests me, of course, is there a danger with tattoos? And there's one or two things that I found on the internet about how certain parts of the body, they're now starting to find that the black, particularly, I guess it must be a carbon-based black, is migrating through the body and accumulating in certain organs. So, if you really are worried about toxicity, you might want to start by not injecting it into your skin anyway, if you're a tattoo fan.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have any tattoos. I don't have any heavy feelings about, people want to get tattoos. But it's rather sort of contradictory to sit in front of me and worried about toxicity when you've just injected a whole load of pigments into your skin anyway, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and I think also the particle size is too big to get into your pores anyway, is what I've heard.
It is. I mean, but then specifically, the human body has this thing called skin, which is an organ of the body. I think it's one of the largest, certainly in surface area, unless that you could argue the entire inside of a lung is because of the way it works, but that's another matter. It's designed to do a job which is to keep bacteria, viruses out, which it does its job very well, otherwise we'd all be dead. Bacteria and virus particles are eminently smaller, considerably smaller than, say, a pigment particle. Yeah. And it all gets stopped by the skin. Solvents in your hands, of course, are a baddie because a solvent can penetrate through the skin, particularly if you've washed a lot, because it means you've degreased your hands, which is a natural barrier, so certain solvents can penetrate through the skin.
And breathing it in.
I mean, always open studios are much better in terms of ventilation.
In and out is what I usually say. Like 2 windows. but also any kind of medium, not all mediums, but most mediums by medium definition that would have any kind of rectified turpentine, you're breathing it in.
Just if you read the small print well, you should all read the small print on all the products you use anyway. You will be surprised at all these household names of products now that we artists have become very familiar with, and they sort of go to. Read that small print, you'll still have some surprises there.
Yeah.
A lot of them are still, even though that they're deodorized, just because you can't smell it doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah.
And that does worry me because people assume things, and it's wrong often.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about, or we were kind of getting towards, was the idea that like when you go and let's say you have cadmium red medium or cadmium red, let's just say, and the pigment manufacturer comes to you, there's still variations of cadmium red PR108.
Yeah.
How do you choose? Like, what's your thoughts on it?
I just looked at their shade card and chose one smack in the middle and thought that's going to be my cadmium red. It was that simple.
And then you kind of, do you like have a wheel or something that you're kind of like trying to fill it out to say like, because you and I remember we were talking about the color wheel and there's a whole chunk out of the green.
I just use these things. Because when you're painting, that's what you're using. When you look at a painting, that's what you're using. So I think sometimes you can over-scientize it, if that's a word. You can over-analyze things. Yeah, if it makes you feel better, if you want to go and pay for a piece of equipment or read research on something, if it makes you feel better, whether it makes you paint better, I don't know. I think we should all have greater understanding of these things, yes, but don't let them interfere with your painting process. It's got to be you, the artist, and what you see.
Yeah.
So in answer to your question, yes, when pigment representatives came and sat in front of me and said, these are our range of cadmiums, going through from the clarity deep reds right the way through to the oranges to the bright yellows. Yeah, I just looked at probably the 25 shades there were and just said, well, that'll be my lemon, and that one there looks smack in the middle of the yellow, so that'll be my cadmium mid.
Right.
We just call it cadmium yellow.
Yeah, and then we're assigning a name to it that kind of hits something on a color wheel, right? Like cadmium red medium and cadmium red light and cadmium red deep would be 3 shades from the 25 that you're assigning those 3 names.
But I just looked at what I regarded as a nice deep red, and I had a choice probably of a handful around that sort of wavelength, if you like.
Yeah.
And, I just thought smack in the middle spectrum red.
Yeah.
Smack in the middle spectrum yellow. And there was, and then of course when you look at the cusp where they change over to the orange, well, what's the smack in the middle orange? So I just went for what I regarded as smack in the middle.
Yeah. And then from there, when you fill out the line, because you what I love is that you're always like adding a color or two or introducing.
Yeah.
You and I were talking about, I think there was like, is it 18 more colors that you're going to be adding?
Oh no, 40.
4.
40.
That's even close.
Coincidentally, it also probably celebrates the fact I've been a paint maker commercially paint maker for 40 years. So
Congrats.
40 new cars for 40 years, thank you. So they'll be coming out soon. As I said earlier, I got started commercially 82, 83, 84-ish. One of my first jobs was for the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I've got dates of that because I saved that material. But certainly I was selling paint from that period in the 80s. So round about now it's 40 years.
Yeah.
It's not as if there's going to be big fireworks and celebrations or anything like that. It's just the reason why we're putting new colours in is because when I developed the watercolours, I got my hands on some amazing new pigments, and of course as I was playing around with them, formulating the watercolours, I'd look at them and go, wow, wouldn't this look good in oil? And so of course I couldn't resist it. I'd have to put some into oil, grind it around, see what I could, knock it around, as I say, see what I could get out of it from, artist's point of view. And as soon as I saw some of those new colours, I think, oh yes, I thought, oh, I've got to have this to the range. And then before you knew it, I had 30, and then I was sort of up in the mid 30s, and then someone said, if it's 40, it could be, celebrating the 40 years. I thought, well, that's a good enough reason to stop at 40. Otherwise, I go on probably to 50 or 60.
That's awesome.
Which will take us up to something like 130, 140 colours, which is I think in the watercolours we've got 134. So yeah, you can see the thinking. I'd wanted with the watercolours to parallel what the range was in the oils. Of course, not everything works in a water-based system in the way that it can do in an oil. For instance, a lead white you just wouldn't want in an open system such as a watercolour, which is always soluble.
Yeah.
And yeah, just as soon as I saw some of those colours, I just thought, oh yes,
Yeah.
got to have them.
What prompted you to do the watercolor?
Well, being a watercolourist as well as an oil painter myself, although I'm probably 75% oil painter in all honesty, I've been asked for so many years by artists, am I going to do watercolours?
Yeah.
And well, I'm 64 now. I like to think I'm still good as a paint maker for maybe a couple more decades. Who knows? And in terms of my own pride in what I've done, and I like what I do, and we're also looking at gouache, and
Yeah.
and as a lot of you will know, we do a range of coloured primers as well.
Yeah.
I don't have intentions to do acrylics, simply because for me as an artist, acrylic doesn't interest me.
Yeah.
I know there's probably acrylic painters out there and who are probably turning over thinking, oh, why did he say that? But for me as an artist, I just don't see colour intensity. I tried to paint with acrylics way back. Oh, I'm sure they've come a long way since, but in the 1970s, and I just couldn't get them to do what I wanted, and so I reverted back to oils pretty quickly. And I also noticed that the chroma is not there, and I think I'm almost certain that that's because the formula doesn't allow you to have as much pigment in the system in each colour.
Yeah. I tend to find that also in acrylics, they lean a little bit more heavily on the organic pigments than they are on the mineral. Not quite sure why, but
that's probably because you find that it's easier to keep them brighter and cleaner, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certain drawbacks, for instance, with a cadmium colour. I mean, a cadmium colour is an inorganic pigment, and we can talk about whether something's organic or inorganic in a minute. It's nothing to do with being green or vegan or any credentials like that. It's purely a definition in chemistry. Nothing to do with organic food, it being better, nothing at all to do with that. One of the drawbacks, for instance, with cadmium red is if you put it with titanium white, it doesn't make the cleanest and most zingy of pinks.
Yeah.
And whereas if you put
Pyrrole red
with titanium, you'll find it cleaner and crisper and all the rest of it. Yeah. And that's probably because of the way that the particle of pigment is working and its actual physical size and shape as a particle on a microscopic scale, and what it does to light as light lands on it and goes through it or bounces off it in each context. And certain pigments, usually smaller particle pigments, will produce cleaner colours.
Yeah, which are organic.
Tend to be organic,
typically,
yeah. And so that's the reason.
Yeah, one of the things in the book that I tried to do was kind of give guidance to the painters or students that organic colors are typically transparent for the most part.
Yes.
And then mineral or inorganic pigments are opaque.
Tend to be, yeah.
They will mix different opaque colors into opaque or predictable. They kind of go in a straight line. But transparent into opaque is an arc in color.
Yeah.
Where they'll sometimes increase in intensity or chroma.
Yes.
So I think that's kind of sounds like the same thing that you're saying with them too. The new line of 40, seems like there's a lot of organic pigments that you're introducing.
Yeah, they will be predominantly because there's only so many inorganic pigments that are. I mean, industry tends to produce. Well, I don't want to make sweeping statements here because I'm not sort of a. My end of the pigment world, of course, is the artist's end. It doesn't tend to be. Someone might tell me that, oh no, automotive industry, for instance, which I've quoted, uses huge amounts of inorganic, and I would have to say I don't know. But most new pigments tend to be organics. I think it's because it's easier for them to manufacture them, cleaner and more sexier colours, if you like.
And cheaper, right?
Cheaper cost is another consideration. I mean, they tend to be what I call designer pigments. And they do their jobs very, very well. I mean, pigment manufacturers, modern pigment manufacturers, the likes of the big chemical houses are so good at what they do.
Yeah.
And they'll design pigments specifically for, say, going into plastics or going into a water-based system or a resin-based system.
Yeah.
And it's after several thousand years, man's got very good at making pigments.
Yeah. And that's also one of the things I love about your labels. There's a bit of an education on there where sometimes you're like phthalocyanine lake, right? So you put the word laking on there. And I'd never heard it before until you schooled me on what laking was.
Oh yeah, well a lake is it's an old-fashioned term. It actually comes from a Hindi word meaning 10,000. You think of all words connected in there, from the word lacquer, because when they in the Far East draw lacquer from trees, it's always got 10,000 insects in every cupload, bucket load, or whatever you like to describe it. Because being as you can imagine, coming from a tree like that, you're going to get little insects and bugs everywhere, But then the word got used more by pigment manufacturers because what they do, if you take a dye, which of course could be vegetable derived, and you're thinking, look, this colour's really nice, if only I could get that colour into my oil. Well, of course, because one's water-based and one's oil-based, they won't emulsify together. So pigment manufacturers had a really clever solution, which was you stain with that dye what we call an inert pigment, something like ground up chalk, which has no tint value of its own. It's if you grind chalk and put it into water, of course it becomes virtually transparent, like Vaseline. And so you stain it, fix it to it, and then of course you've created a synthetic pigment. And that's why we could get those colours. It's a way of tricking nature to be able to get it into the paint.
Yeah, and I remember the way you described it to me as I was trying to wrap my head around it was like hair dyeing, right?
Well, yes, it's basically you're dyeing something which is going to carry the colour in. In our case, it's the a ground up either alumina or a hydrate chalk, and that again, as I say, is done by the pigment manufacturer, not us.
Mm-hmm.
They do the clever bit. We're just the mixer. I mean, I think that on a microscopic nanoscale, that when a hair dye works by alkaline materials making the hair open up like a sponge, it becomes more porous, and then the dye goes in, and then you rinse the hair, and then the
pore closes.
All the pores in the hair surface close, and trapping the colour, and that's effectively, as I understand it, what happens.
Yeah, and it seems almost like it's a bit more of on the scientific side, more in which the way you think of like diffuse transmission, where light is transmitting through a translucent.
Yeah, I mean, this is more your area than mine, Todd. It's. I know you dwell very much in the physics and stuff like that. I mean, I'm not a physicist. I have almost a layperson's understanding of these things, and I'm the first person to put my hand up when I don't know something. Life's taught me that if you don't know something, say pretty early on, you don't know about it. Otherwise,
don't pretend.
Don't tempt fate, because it's not a poker game. If it were a poker game, you wouldn't get out with your shirt if that's the case. So I don't know those pieces of equipment or that process.
Yeah, diffuse transmission would mean like with our ears in the full sun.
Oh yeah, with the sun coming through.
Yeah, in the same way that it's kind of like stained glass window.
Yeah.
Like light transmitting through a pigment, and therefore high increase of chroma.
Yeah.
Where an opaque pigment is absorbing the light.
Yes.
Not going through it.
Yeah.
And therefore, it seems to go in with your statement of saying that you'll have a cleaner, brighter red with a naphthol or P-roll than you would with an opaque mineral.
Yeah, and I guess that's because it's a micro small pigment particle. Small particle pigments tend to be more transparent on the whole.
Yeah.
Organic pigments also tend to be very thirsty. They'll take up a lot of the the medium in which they're dispersed.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because if you paint with more of them, you'll find that in contrast to mineral or inorganic pigments like raw or burnt umber,
Yeah.
which tend to sink in, right? Because they're less oil content, right? But also the thirst.
No, they're quite interesting because you're absolutely right. They'll tend when Todd says about them sinking, what he means is that on drying they render themselves as dull and matte looking. They do, and it's a real nuisance actually because from a painter's point of view, and I love working with umbers, but I know in advance that if I paint just with an umber, that area is going to dry matte.
Yeah.
And no, I'm not completely sure of what the physics are. There are iron oxides. They tend to be some of them are natural, so they could be clays. And when they dry, they change the surface, if you like, of the oil paint, and
the perception of the color.
Totally, yeah. And once it's dry, you can always lick your finger and put it back on like that, and then you'll see the fruity color that you had before.
Yeah.
So
not when it's wet.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Once it's dry, I mean, put a damp finger on it, or even just wipe a bit of linseed oil over that surface.
Yeah.
That fruity color will come back, and then of course that's one of the reasons we varnish, to reunify and to re-get that fruitiness back. But the umbers will do it. Lamp black will do it. When I paint, I compensate I simply put an extra bit of stand oil. Literally dab my brush. I use one or two mediums, and some of them have got stand oil in, which of course stand oil tends to dry, making paint very glossy and wet looking.
Yeah.
So that's how I compensate. It is a pain, I grant you that. The interesting thing is you've got transparent oxide brown, which doesn't do it to the same extent.
Those are Mars colors, right?
When Mars color just means a synthetic iron oxide.
Yeah.
Transparent oxide reds, yellows, and the browns, they tend to behave more like an organic pigment. They're very, very, very small pigment particle. Huge thirst in terms of they're taking up the medium. But they're inorganic. They are iron oxides.
Yeah, they're almost like cleaner versions, right?
They are. They get used in the wood dye industry a lot for that very reason. In fact, I think that was their original making, and we just got lucky because it's one of those things that we artists could leap on the shirt tails of the wood dye industry.
Yeah, and they're fantastic. I think it's when you take them and you hydrate them, then they turn transparent, which is pretty fantastic because you take something like PR101, like a transparent earth red, I think is the color that you have, right? Or red earth?
We have transparent red oxide.
Red oxide. That's
is pigment red 101. But you see the code system, we're talking about the color index system, that also has the same code for things like Venetian red.
Yeah. And English red.
And English red and some siennas and things like that. So the color index system it'll appear slightly contradictory at certain points, which is it's one of those annoying things that
definitely in the iron oxides.
Yeah, the rules. There's no apples to apples, unfortunately, with this.
Yeah.
There's some contradictions within these systems which can frustrate a lot of people who are newcomers to this and want to have I'm sorry if we don't always give clean, concise answers. It's
much more complex.
It is.
More nuanced.
It is. Yeah.
But yeah, so those are great colors. Like I do a lot of my underpaintings with transparent red oxide.
Yeah.
The brown oxide is also a good one too.
I don't know if you've noticed, we've even brought one out in the form of transparent our acrylic primer.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I love it.
Good,
I think you also have the burnt sienna.
We do an opaque.
PR101.
Yeah, we do a semi-opaque version as well. And just so people understand it, you can put a white ground of a normal acrylic primer down, and then go over the top, so you get like a scumbly Griselle sort of finish to the work, and it's just another way to be able to manipulate that surface. Another one we do is my favourite is actually the moss green.
Yeah.
Which is designed for portrait painters.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I actually just started to play around with that one.
Yeah.
I was doing the neutral gray 5, I think.
Yeah.
Which is funny because you have the N5 on there, and people think right away that you're Munsell based, but you're not.
No, it's the only. My own philosophy is that Munsell is, yeah, it's a useful tool for people to explore,
Communicate, right?
to communicate, but I wouldn't be advocating it to be the way that you paint. Otherwise, you're just making it so well,
Mechanical.
Mechanical is about paint. You get to the point where you're almost painting by numbers,
Yeah.
and things like spontaneity and painting from the heart.
Yeah.
That's where the magic comes from.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, I think, about being a poet, right?
Yeah,
And the expression can be lost if you get too mechanical in that.
I know, and we've been talking also about AI,
Yeah.
and I think that Munsell is sort of one of those things. It's useful, but don't make it a way of life.
It does
Learn
seem like
from it.
it does seem like AI could be the next step towards it. Where you said, Alexa, here's the chip, or here's what I need to learn,
Yeah,
or you aim a device at it and say, how do I mix this with transparent oxide?
I'm sure the technology could provide that now.
Yeah, I feel like we just are one step away from it. And then when I look at that kind of stuff, I go, that's not the direction I want my paint to go.
Also, I mean, I was having a discussion with artists recently, and they were saying about AI and would it make art paintings we know it redundant? And my answer was no. That's the same conversation they had when photography was invented.
Yeah.
And in a sense, it just became another tool in the arsenal of artists to use, whether you're a photographic artist or a painter. It's just another tool at your disposal. I mean, okay, there's probably several processes now where you could create a photograph that at first glance would look like a painting, and then you get really close to it and you realise it's pixelated, for example. I think you could have the same situation with an AI created Rembrandt lookalike.
You've seen that they did that, right?
Yes, I know.
2018?
Yeah, and yeah, very convincing, but I don't purport to be any expert like Van Wittering, but I know that he would look at it and go, it's like after Rembrandt,
Yeah.
but it's something not quite right. You
Yeah.
see, human beings will still, those machines can only imitate. They can't jump ahead of where we're going, and that's the whole point. The artificial intelligence can only follow the intelligence that man's already had.
You can only average the data.
Yeah, it can sort the data quicker. It can probably draw upon huge data sources. I mean, after all, you could have a supercomputer painting from every painting that's ever been photographed and put into a digital library.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it's
they
only,
do that, right? With Google Images.
Yeah, sure. But it's only going to be, you can fool most of the people most of the time, but it's not, doesn't become real.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in a sense you could almost say that art is real. Real art is real creativity, whereas the best bit of AI is just another version of plagiarism.
Something that is
Yeah,
existent.
because it's already drawn from something that's already existing, and therefore it's just another version of plagiarism.
Right,
It's-
and content creation is what the individual has.
Yeah, it can. You know, I think that AI is just a plagiarizing machine.
Yeah, which does come in handy for rote kind of work.
Oh yeah,
Definitely ChatGPT
and
for writing.
and as I say, it's another tool in the artist's arsenal. I think it will become, whether or not it is passed off as superior art, that's another matter. I mean, there was, when you go back in history to when photography came along, and the portrait painters, of course, thought, well, here comes redundancy, because people are just going to have a photograph taken and put up, and yes, and I'm sure that's probably what happened for a number of decades until they realised that there was something lacking, that a photograph's great,
Yeah.
but a painting's that little bit greater.
You know what I find remarkable? There's some interesting quotes by Paul de la Roche, who was, I believe, a British painter. Was he? He's at the, I don't think, maybe not, maybe French. De la Roche, C-H-E at the end.
I don't know the artist you're talking about, but go on.
He's I associate him with British because he's in the National Gallery, and he has the beheading of Lady Grey, I think is what it is.
Lady Jane Grey. Oh yeah, I know.
Amazing painting, right?
Fantastic painting.
And one of his quotes that he had was, once the camera came along, thank God, now we don't have to do those silly portraits that we had to do. And I almost see it as like our art as a whole began to shift away from copying the real in
Well,
a sense.
that's, I think the role of art in those days is now what you're talking about was that the painting was telling a story.
Yeah, exactly.
And there was a responsibility there for the artist became storyteller as well as artist.
Yeah.
I mean, another stunning painting is The Experiment with an Air Pump by Joseph Wright of Derby, which I presume you know this painting?
Remind me?
It's of, they basically got some type of scientific glass vessel with a dove inside it, and they're pumping the air out, so of course they're creating a vacuum, and so that the dove is suffocating. And there's a circle of people. One's sort of the mad scientist with hair looking, like mad scientist look. And then there's a little girl who, of course, is crying because of the loss of the dove. And then there's a couple of lovers in the corner who aren't even, they're looking at each other rather than the experiment. Google that painting.
So there's a reaction. Yeah,
Experiment with an Air Pump, Joseph Wright of Derby. And it's astoundingly well executed. And my goodness, when you, if you like analysing shadows, my goodness, the guy can do it. I dream of being able to paint like that.
So that painting is actually in the same museum?
The National Gallery in London.
It's amazing. Yeah, I feel like when I look at those, that quote by De La Roche, and I'm like, it feels like painting slowly turned after the invention of photography away from having to, as you said, be narrative or capture everyday life into expression.
When I just looked at the date of that Joseph Wright of Derby, I think it was 1758. Don't quote me in case I've just misread it. I think photography came in was 1820s.
Yeah, about there. Yeah, 1820, 1830.
So clearly, Joseph Wright of Derby was still 70 years ahead. I still to this day don't know how he was able, because any of you have ever tried, can you imagine trying to draw and paint by candle or lamplight?
Yeah, it's insane. Even Rembrandt, right?
Yeah, I mean, you might be able to do it by memory the next day, which, yes, but
trying to paint in low light, right?
I mean, if you look at the painting we're talking about, and I think you can show them put a caption up with it. Don't forget to credit them, otherwise you get into trouble, don't you? You'll realise the ability of the artist to be able to paint like that is astounding.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And that's, even by today's standards, would be amazing. Yeah.
And that was pre-photography.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely incredible.
I mean, let's be honest, if you look at those figures, and assuming people can see it right now, there's a guy with long hair like mine looking straight at you, and it's the light in his face is astounding. And any of us today, if we thought, I want to paint that figure, the first thing you're going to do, of course, is reach for the camera. Let's be honest.
Yeah, yeah.
Simply because even today, with interior lighting like we've got, if someone were in front of you with that level of shadow on the face, it wouldn't be possible in the same room, because you're over here, they're over there, and you need light here.
Yeah, well, there would be ways you could kind of do it, but I know what you mean.
Oh.
You'd have to have a flag.
You might be able to, I can't.
Yeah, you'd have to have a flag, which would mean that a light source on you and your canvas, which is what they do in film, and then a light source on almost like what theater is, that separate each other so they don't overlap.
Yeah.
But even so, like a candlelight doesn't have a, what's the term? A spray of light that could... You'd have to have it right next to your canvas.
As I say, I keep stressing I'm not a scientist, but I'm guessing that one candle power is 1 lumen. I don't know if it came from that. Is it?
It could be. Yeah, it could be.
Because I know when they used to rate lighthouses, it would be so many, this light is so many tens of thousands of candles, as it were.
Yeah, it could be right.
Yeah.
I mean, typically like a floodlight is 1600 lumen, and but yeah, the inverse square law. It's called light fall off. It's like the brightness or the strength of the light
as it dissipates in distance.
Yeah, and normally the inverse square law would show that you don't have a lot of room, or it's going to fall off. And for a candle, I think the inverse square law is like a foot or 2 feet.
Okay, now, did you know that on a dark night you're meant to be able to see a candle at 11 miles if you've got good eyesight?
Wow, that's incredible.
I just know that. I'm sorry, I just had to throw that in.
Hmm. There's plenty of artists too that I think would go out with like candle wreaths around their head to do night painting. But again, the luxury of today is we could just snap
I
a
know.
photo.
I've seen artists who are up doing nocturnes with
Yeah,
those little lights over the top of their
like a book light or
Bichard,
something.
yeah,
Yeah.
Bichard boxes and stuff like that.
Definitely a different world. But, that also brings me back to where we kind of started with all this, which is you're also a painter.
Yeah.
And you don't really show your work, but every time I come to your house, I see your paintings here, and
Yeah, but I mean, if you wanted for the benefit of these guys, show them one or two.
oh yeah,
then
yeah.
then of course we can do that. Prepare for a disappointment. No, I'm joking.
No,
I as I was saying to Todd when we were having lunch just now, I haven't sold a painting in 30 years. I'm fortunate because I've got the income from selling of the paints that as an artist, I can paint whenever I want and as much as I want. I don't ever attempt to sell my paintings. I give them away.
yeah, but you're not trying to sell.
No, I'm not.
I think there's a difference.
No,
Yeah.
I'm not.
It's not like they've been sitting in a shop and you're just waiting.
No, and
Or people actually have come to you
people
saying
have-
that they're
yeah,
interested.
people have been kind enough to say they'd like to buy them. A few of them. I'll be honest with you. If they survive, and when I say survive, they survive to come off my easel. They're lucky anyway because my hit rate is probably, well, it's got better, but there was a time when I'd have to do 9 paintings to make one succeed, as it were. So the rest were trashed. I think I'm probably getting a hit rate now of maybe 1 out of 3.
That's good. Yeah.
Some people it is, yeah. And I think George Gallo, the artist, told me that his hit rate's about 1 in 30, which was like, whoa.
Yeah. Is he a landscape?
Yeah, that's one of his up there.
Oh yeah. Well, landscape artists are even like when I did go outside and do plein air. Like Leo's always asked me to do it, and I'm just like, if you want to feel good about yourself, I'll come out and paint with you, because I'll do 1 out of every 30. Decent.
I go painting with Mark Sharsha a couple of times, and I've just, well, I usually get home and just scrape it off.
Yeah, and they're great. They hit it almost every time, right?
Yeah, but Mark's a seasoned landscaper. He knows where he's going each time.
Yeah.
I'm still out there, and I'm still struggling with tonal values, and I think by the time Mark's done a painting and is ready to sort of quit for the afternoon, I'm just about getting to the point where I'm scraping off the 3rd time and realizing that. And I got to a point where I thought to myself, I am just a studio artist. I have to get things right before I can move on. And I'm not. I think when I was a young artist, like 20, I could go out into the landscape, and maybe I had more talent then than I got now, and I would just get tonal values right, and I would get going.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's like 3 or 4 musical notes, ding, 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 and if you've got them right in relation to each other, and they're in tune.
Yeah.
Then you've got the foundations of your painting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking literally like, where do you put that line at the horizon? What's the tonal value of the sky? What's the tonal value below it, the horizon? And there's only 3 and once you get that, then it's like those musical notes. If their relationship is correct, then you move on. And it takes me an afternoon to get them, and then I still don't get them. And I can achieve that better with the control of a studio. I mean, I don't know how. I look when I do some of these plein air events, and we get out the landscape, and I go and see people painting out. Some of them are painting in direct sunlight with sunlight coming on the canvases, and I'm squinting. And I've been there. I've tried that, and I find that every mark I make is an exaggeration.
Yeah.
It's either too dark or too light, or certainly too not right. And
yeah, and then you go inside and you look at that thing.
Just think, what could I have been thinking?
Yeah. Yeah, I've done that too.
Yeah.
I've done a couple decent ones, but I actually think it's a beautiful, sobering experience to kind of go outside and try to copy nature or do whatever you want from it, derive
Oh,
from
it's
it,
just sobering, that's for sure.
and then come back in and be like, well, that's a whole thing I'd have to learn how to master.
Yeah, I got to the point where if I went out, I was having to find, let alone having the right subject matter. I then got to coincidentally find that I've got a nice bit of shade I'm under, and
Yeah. Some people do the umbrella, right?
yeah, and then you've got so much kit with you, and it's just.
Yeah.
So I'll be honest with you, a lot of, if it's a landscape, I tend to be working from my own photographs. Um, yeah, it's
Yeah. A little easier to do.
yeah,
Still hard.
and the thing also about, of course, a landscape is the landscape is constantly changing at such a rapid rate.
Yeah. You're painting different moments, like
Yeah,
clouds
you're
coming
you're
over.
chasing that moment always.
Yeah. I remember in 2000, I think it was 17, I went to the Portrait Society in Reston,
Oh yeah,
and you guys were there. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was way too shy. I walked around, I saw all these. I think I saw like Brandon Soloff, and I was like just walking by, seeing name tags, and like Brandon Soloff's like here for Chelsea's Classical Studios. I saw you standing there at your own table. Everyone at their own table, like representing their own company.
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah.
what a wonderful little world.
Oh, I love it. It's great. I mean, that's yeah. I know Brandon well, of course. Um, we will do what we do, and the great thing about
But you're in the trenches. It's not like you're like somebody makes the paint and then I'm just off in whatever
oh,
the
I'm
Caribbean
the
all the time.
I'm the lucky one. I'd rather be at an event like the Portrait Show, talking to artists and looking at their works.
Yeah, you're always at one. Every time I talk to
That's real. That's front line. That's me talking to artists. What could be more pleasurable?
you. Yeah,
Yeah, I could be back in our colour mill, and I often am.
and you are right.
Yeah, constantly. But it's more fun, dare I say, talking to the artists and being out in the field, seeing them, and
Yeah,
just being able to smell the painting
and talk to them.
smell the artist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever get like artists that kind of lead you to be like, you need this color, like any of that kind of stuff? Like, I know you're always listening. Like every time we talk,
Yeah,
like,
I take it in. I'll be honest with you. I think after this length of time, I know what you guys want.
yeah.
I'm confident of it. But
Well, the non-absorbent primer came out of it, right?
yeah, I mean, yes, I listened to the need of artists because they were having such constant struggles finding primers that, acrylic primers that, and I don't like to use this term, acrylic gesso, that aren't drawing all the oil out, making the paintings go dull and matte looking, and then because they're then having to oil out or use retouch varnish.
Yeah.
This alleviates that need most of the time. Yeah, I listen to artists in terms of their needs. One thing that I have heard is, yeah, they want more colours.
Yeah.
I do have artists have said, have you thought about doing colour index number X? And I take all that in, and invariably they'll say things that I was already intending to do.
Yeah.
I mean, another way of looking at it, of course, is looking at some of the other manufacturers who've got larger ranges and looking at colours that we haven't got. That
Yeah.
a lot of these are, have you done a colour like so-and-so's? And so, yeah, I can look at it that way around.
Do you come back into it after and say, like, you introduce a color? Would you then take a look at the data over 2 to 5 years and say, that doesn't sell, we're going to pull it? Have you ever pulled colors?
I've pulled
Or
colours.
discontinued?
I've discontinued a handful of colours because of stability problems,
Mm.
and invariably certain colours. There was one or two lead-based colours which, after a few months, were set rock hard in a tube, which the lead red and a
Minium
variety
red.
of of Naples yellow we had sort of 30 years ago did. I think there's only those two, so I've had to pull those by necessity. In terms of pulling others, there's other colours in the range that I don't personally care for,
Yeah.
but sell very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wear two hats. I wear the artist hat and the commercial hat
Yeah.
of what people need.
That's cool, though.
No, if anything, it's more to come. I mean, sometimes I look at the range and I can look at something like red umber and think, well, it's very close to burnt umber. And I think, yeah, if I was going to slim down there, maybe I'd drop the red umber.
Yeah.
And then I say that to my staff, and they go, well, you should see how much we sell of it then. Okay, fair point.
Yeah.
Or a colour like, say, lemon yellow, which is a very sort of pastel-y, dusty-looking, soft yellow. And I think, does it really bring much to the party? Maybe not. And then if I talk to an artist who uses it, they go, oh, no, fresh tones with magenta, with this, with that. Oh, no, don't get rid of it, please.
Yeah.
And then, or some artists will say something like, I know, but it makes fantastic greys. I mean, I'm the last person who wants a grey. but you guys, you're all out there doing your own thing. And if someone says it makes a fantastic grey, who am I to say that that's wrong?
Yeah.
You are the guys.
Well, and then you've got, which I love, and we've geeked out about many times through talking, is that you've got those old master colors that just nobody has, like vermilion and lapis, and
yeah. Well, we've had difficulty with supply of both those, and I'm hoping, touch wood, that we're getting both back shortly. Yeah, I mean, this is a large part of what I'm about. Of course, is looking over my shoulder to the past, and hence those very traditional pigments. And yeah, of the two hats I wear, one is trying to emulate the palette, the tools of the old masters. On the other hand, I'm also trying to sort of look to the future in terms of the new advances that are made and the exotic colours we have.
Yeah.
I mean, don't make no mistake, I don't think artists have ever had it so good, so in choice of colour, but whether or not they understand the structuring of paint in the way that the old masters did, that's a component that's really missing.
Well, they did a ton with a little. So when you look at like vermilion and how it's stretched to be almost all those red robes and almost no purples.
Yeah, their palettes were far more limited.
Yeah.
I've often debated with artists, I'm sure with you, Todd, is if I don't know, Velasquez was reincarnated and walked into the room today and looked at what we had spread out on the table,
he'd still go back to his palette.
Yeah, or would he'd either say, it'd be either one way or the other. This is incredible. You've got so much choice. I can't wait to paint with all these. Or he'd go, what do you need all these for?
Yeah.
I think probably the latter.
Well, purple is definitely one of those ones in the kind of history.
Yeah,
I was trying to.
It's difficult.
Yeah, we went and saw the Van Gogh show.
Yeah.
And I think it was Tyrian purple.
Yeah.
Or an Eosin, two colors that he used a lot in their Light Fast issues.
Well, Tyrian purple, Van Gogh would not have been using real Tyrian, not Murex. That's the snail.
The snail, yeah.
No, I mean it would be. You need literally 10,000 of them to make. A spec.
Yeah.
And I think I'm right in saying that a lot of Van Gogh's colours were from two companies. One was the German maker Lucas, and the other one Sennelier.
Yeah. That's what they pride themselves on. Still, I think.
Yeah, don't quote me in case if I've made a mistake. I apologise to both those companies. And with great respect to them, they in those days would not have been interested in digging up thousands upon thousands of snails.
Almost millions.
It is millions, and then again, nowadays we've got other purples that are sexier, if you like.
Yeah, but back in the day, I think it was like cobalt violet and
it would have been,
manganese violet.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember when cobalt and manganese
hematite
came along. It would probably have been mid-19th century.
But pre all that, it's like the purples were mixed.
You'd have to mix them from a red and an ultramarine, probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
Prussian was early 18th century. 1708.
Ferrous oxide, I think, right?
Your first ferrous oxide, yeah. And of course, then you'd have to be having to choose your red carefully because a rose madder or a vermilion, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, the best way to, if you were doing that, would be a touch of ultramarine with rose madder would used transparently would be the best way that you're going to get a purple.
So those robes back in the day, all the high chroma was glazing technique.
Probably.
Over probably a grisaille painting.
Yeah.
To get it.
Yeah. Wouldn't have been any other way to do it.
Yeah. So they were doing a lot more and getting high chroma colors like Titian, Tintoretto, and all the Venetians.
But as you and I have discussed, it's also context, or what we in the UK call local colour, because Todd and I were discussing earlier on situations in paintings where you're painting away and you either can't get enough high tone, lightness, because you haven't left yourself anywhere to go. You've already used your whitest white and you can't go whiter. I'm talking about, say, a situation where you're painting a landscape and you've already used down near the horizon on your sky as light as you can go, your white fluffy clouds.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you've got the rays of the sun directly from the sun to depict. You've left yourself no tonal area to go up into. Or I had a context recently when I was painting a sunset, and I had already painted the 90% of the painting, and then I needed a red that would just push it even further, and I didn't have any red. There wasn't any red left until I fortunately discovered the Pyrrol red, the 254. And I realised that it wasn't so much the redness I was looking for. It surprised me because it was a coolness that I didn't know was going to be the answer in my mind. I just couldn't. But when I put the paint up there, I realised it was the one.
The key that unlocked it.
It was lucky.
Yeah.
And of course, the other way of doing it, as I said to Todd, would have been to do the painting backwards. So you choose that higher value and back engineer all the colours in relation to it.
Yeah.
To make sure that you've got the range, either hue colour range or the tonal range before you. And that's why I think preparation and planning works.
Yeah. Makes
sense as opposed to just leaping in. Leaping in's fun.
Yeah.
Leaping is a lot of fun, but you're very unusual. It's very unusual, I think, for an artist. You might pull off a very.
I think
raw,
some do. Yeah, some do and some don't. Right.
It,
Rose Fratson, she jumps in.
I've seen Kwong leap in as well,
Yeah.
but Kwong can seem to bring a painting out of anything.
Yeah, I think the two of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both astoundingly talented. Isn't that annoying they can do that? Yeah, I mean, every time I'm with Kwong, and I think he's bewildered why we all can't paint like him.
Yeah.
And I've had many conversations with him, and he says I could teach everyone to paint like this, and he probably could. In his mind, he thinks he could teach us. Whether or not our minds could open up enough for us to be able to learn, of course, is the question. I'm sure he's right that he could. He's the ability to teach us. I mean, he can really create order from nowhere, can't he?
Yeah, yeah. I think he starts with chaos, and Rose is chaos. I remember watching Rose and Rob Liberace paint next to each other, and Rob is like known as painterly, and
Yes.
he just looked over and was like that is. How are you going to corral this?
Well,
and she did.
I think Rose is in chaos and loves it. That's where she thrives. And I think probably when she starts painting, most of the time she either knows exactly where it's going to go but ends up somewhere else,
Yeah.
or knows exactly where it's going to go and that's where she ends up,
Mm-hmm.
or has no idea where it's going to go and it doesn't matter anyway. She just arrives.
Yeah. It's definitely entertaining.
Oh yeah, she's an extraordinary person and a lot of fun. She is a classic. She's also got the classic personality of an artist.
Yeah.
She marches entirely to her own drum,
Yeah.
and she's the centre of her own universe. I don't mean this in a negative way.
Yeah.
She knows what she wants in life, and she does it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the beautiful thing, right? You get to go in there and interact with them and then kind of watch them perform, too, and see what they do.
Oh, yeah, and with her it is a performance, isn't it? Well, I think
Yeah.
all the guys we've just been talking about. Rob, I don't know so well. I know his paintings, of course. I'd love to own a Rob painting. I love the way he gets. I remember there's that one of the guy rowing the boat a few years ago. I can't remember where it was. And I took photographs of it because he just has this way of getting the veins to stand up, and it looked like alizarin crimson with the lead white he'd used in hair, and it was just.
Yeah.
He always has that grittiness, doesn't he, about
Yeah.
flesh and light.
Well, what's interesting is that he has that textural element to it. I think Kwong has it, too.
Yeah.
I haven't seen Roses enough to really study them, but Rob is so knowledgeable about anatomy, but I think it's also the brush that he loads it, and most artists don't because they're kind of going like, I'm gonna guess this is right, and then I'm gonna put a little bit more paint, and he's just nails it.
Yeah, and the other thing is that what you've just said, the inner voice of an artist is absolutely right. If you have self-doubt, it's going to show through in the paint.
Yeah.
So you've got to, and I know that all the guys we've just been talking about, they have no self-doubt, they just deliver it.
Well, that's why they're there.
Yeah,
they're
of course.
Kind of like performing.
Yeah. And I think all those self-conscious inner voices you have, in some ways, the worst thing that could ever happen to you is you're halfway through a painting and someone comes along and goes, "Oh wow, that's incredible! Whatever you've done, keep going with it."
Yeah, and then you
because then
go
you think,
sideways.
Oh, I don't want to mess this up, do I? I've got to be careful here.
Yeah.
And then it all becomes precious, and you're scared to make the brush stroke.
Yeah.
And you may as well stop at that point.
Yeah. I find that a lot of the times when I'm painting, when I'm doing something good, I still am not quite sure. I'm still kind of like, I think it is, but I'm just going to keep going. And then the next day I'll come back and go, that's actually pretty good. Like.
Yeah, I had a discussion with a mutual friend of ours, Gary Kravitz, and I have a way of describing a certain situation I get to with the painting where I want to attack it. And I mean that, I don't mean I'm suddenly going to not have any consideration for what's already there and like that, but I want to be ruthless about the decision making I'm making.
Yeah.
To take it further, I want to be brave, because if you're 3/4 of the way through that painting, you say, "Oh, it's actually pretty good."
Yeah.
That's the worst place you can be.
Yeah.
As soon as you know that, it's over.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to get it back. Then at that point, you've got to look at that painting as if you've only been there 5 minutes painting, and you're still looking like, "Oh, what have I got to correct? This bit's not working." Out or over the top.
Yeah.
You've got to keep pushing it, and that's a very hard thing to maintain. We all do it because we all recognise when our painting's on the whole better than that, as it is most of the time. We all want those breakthrough works.
Yeah.
It's creating that mental environment in your own head for them to come along, if you like. They emerge.
Yeah.
I think sometimes our best works we're not aware of it for a couple of years. Thank goodness.
Yeah, I agree.
And then you suddenly it's usually the one that you didn't think was that's no good, and you chuck it to the back of the studio, and then 2 years later you're having a clear out and you go, "Oh,
yeah,
that's actually quite interesting."
Yeah.
Whatever I was doing that day, I wish I could think like that most days.
I find that a lot too.
Yeah.
That, like, I kind of leave a note for myself, which I don't know, and then I'll go back and I've evolved and go, "Oh, that's interesting," and then I'll go back in and go down that road a little bit.
Yeah.
And then it's this kind of swaying between, "Oh, wait, what was I doing over there?" And
do you ever get to a point? Well, I get this. Tell me if you get this, where you're doing a painting, and it's all right, and you get to a point where it's like a fork in the road. You don't know which way to go with it.
Yeah.
And it can be right down to the use of certain colour.
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking there and you're thinking, I just don't know which direction to go with it. And I mean that sincerely. I could go either way.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it's because I've got myself to the limit of my ability, and I can't push that next stage. I don't want to lose the painting.
Yeah.
But I suppose in a sense I should just shut up and paint.
Well, there's definitely times where I'll push through it, and I've had moments, and I still have them, and I think that's what people don't think.
But do you get to the point where, like I said, I don't know how to paint the next bit, but I've still got to push through? And it's like, I'm jolly well going to stand here until it's done.
Yeah, I think sometimes you don't know if the painting is good because we're sitting judging it the whole time, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes taking a break, which is why I used to garden, to come back in and see it with fresh eyes. Some people hold up a mirror, some people flip it upside down. But I think we can't accurately judge it if you're stuck in it.
You see, I use a mirror quite a bit because it's from a composition. I mean, some of you all know it's very useful. But even if you work constantly with a mirror, it's still that point where I don't know which way to go. I don't know. I don't know if at that point you should leave it a month and perhaps come back, or
It's
a
not a
week,
bad
or
idea. We were talking about Malcolm Gladwell earlier with Blink, and I watched his master class, and one of the interesting things that I found with him was to work out his ideas. He would write versions of his books or ideas for books, and then he would just take it and hide it for 3 to 6 months and come back to it. And I think it was Stephen King. I was listening to the same thing about it. Maybe it was Seth Rogen.
Yeah.
I think it was either of the two. And they were just saying, like, a good idea is a good idea, and it's going to stand the test of time. And putting yourself in a position like that to come back, you'll know
I
if
tell
you
you,
want to finish
I tell
it.
you what works for me. Sometimes, anyway. If I'm in doubt and I've maybe got half a dozen paintings that I'm working on, I'll put them in rooms of the house where they don't normally reside, odd angles, and rooms that we may not go in for. I mean, we don't live in a huge mansion. Don't get the wrong idea. We've got a 4-bedroom house here, but it might mean that I put a couple of paintings in a room that I don't go into maybe for a couple of weeks,
Yeah.
or downstairs in the basement or up in the attic, and then you walk around the house. You open the door and there's that moment, that book Blink we just
Right.
quoted.
Yeah.
There's that split-second
You
moment
know right away.
where you see that painting like another person looking at it.
Yeah.
And you have that millisecond of insight where you can appraise yourself completely without prejudice.
Right.
And it's very, very telling. I might have told you the story once. There was I saw an article in the UK, and it was written just after 9/11, and they were interviewing this guy his brother had been killed in one of the Twin Towers, and he was actually a native North American Indian of descent, and he still lives in the wilderness, and the police often use him as a tracker if there's a person, a runaway, and they'll get him in because he can track animals and people like you won't believe.
Amazing.
And they interviewed him, and in it he was saying that he can almost psychoanalyze. When he sees a man's footprints, he can tell so much about that man, about
Right.
let alone the obvious things like health, how healthy his stride is, how much he weighs, how old he is. He says, I can literally, and I think that sometimes with artists you can look at a paintbrush stroke and tell so many things about what the artist was thinking. But anyway, coming back to this tracker guy, he said there's only one track of human beings that I never want to see, and that's my own.
Mm.
And he said, because if I came upon my own tracks without, for a moment, like, whose footprints in the sand on the beach are these? He said, I'd be afraid of what I might learn about myself.
Yeah. It's interesting.
And it's a bit like when you leave your own tracks, your own paintings around a house,
Yeah.
and you suddenly come upon one, and what you can learn about yourself you didn't know.
I think it's a good thing though.
It is.
I love it.
It's that self-revealing. I mean, would you really want to see, if you sat down and had 10 years of psychoanalysis and your psychiatrist was able to encapsulate it into a 30-second report as to what really goes on in Todd Casey's head, and you could read it in say 30 seconds or wherever, that's going to be a pretty scary read, isn't it? To be able to really understand yourself.
It's like Pandora's box.
It is.
Not everyone would want to open it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
However, the revelation of being able to see one's own painting and seeing the inner self in the painting, yes.
Yeah.
We think we're opening that box.
Yeah.
Are we really? That's such a good example there, because if we could open the Pandora's box of our own paintings to see who we really were,
Yeah.
how many of us would really be truly brave enough to do that?
Yeah. That's interesting. I do like kind of going, I've had some collectors, or even like my parents own some early stuff, and it seems to almost be like listening, like, oh my God, I used to listen to 80s music or
Yeah.
something, and you're like, I'm beyond that. But at the time, it was inspiring.
Of course.
So it's almost like a window back to an old photo or version of yourself that you're not anymore.
I might have mentioned to you, when I was mid-30s, I lost my mother, and I'd stored, most of my artwork was stored in the attic of our house, and we of course had to clear our house out. I took the whole lot down the garden and burnt it, and I went around the house, and paintings that she had of mine on the walls I took down the garden and burnt. And it was a sort of more than a clear out, you could say.
Yeah.
And I was, the reason I destroyed a lot of the paintings was because they were painted by a young man, the early version of Michael Harding,
Yeah.
who wasn't very good, certainly isn't any good today. But I didn't. I was my worst critic, as it were.
Mm.
Whereas I couldn't accept who that Michael Harding was then. I think I can do a little more now, and of course I regret enormously what I did.
Well, I mean, I think the proof is that every time we sit down and have lunch or dinner, we're overlooking your painting, which you don't want to part with, right? Because you've had people ask you.
Yeah, maybe it's. I think really.
Sounds like you're happier with your art.
It's a dangerous thing to be happy with your own painting. We know that, and I'm not happy with that painting. But the good thing is, it seems that a lot of people are happy with that painting that I've done, and therefore that's why, I don't ask people what they think, because I don't want them to go, "Oh, that's really nice, Michael. Oh, wow."
Yeah.
Because then you're not getting an answer.
Fishing for compliments.
Yeah. What I like is if someone walks in the house and goes, "Wow, where did that come from?"
Yeah.
"Oh, that's great, Michael, is this yours?"
Yeah.
Then I think to myself, you know what, that might be all right.
Yeah.
That's what I want to hear, and that's probably also why yes, I could have sold it. Karen, my wife, likes it too much. I like it too much. Also, either way, it was a milestone painting for me.
Yeah.
It was probably the first proper painting that I'd done and accomplished, if you like, in 10 years, and it was during COVID.
Yeah.
And we all needed something.
I think you had just taken that off the easel when we had first met.
Right.
And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful painting.
Well, thank you.
I know you're fishing for compliments, but I think it's
beautiful. The other thing I found that when I was a younger artist, I was very sensitive to anti-compliments, if you like, as much as compliments. And I found that if people said something negative about my painting, when I couldn't get it out of my head, then as I painted, and it switched me off as an artist, and I went years on occasions without painting because they're things stuck in my head. And when I look back now and think of who those people were, I realised that they had nothing going on in their brains anyway. So it's not sort of like an excuse to dismiss their words, but they had no empathy or understanding with me whatsoever. They were just trying to hurt.
Yeah.
To elevate themselves, as it were.
Yeah.
Now, I care what people say and think about my art, but I don't need them to like it. I can survive. If you'd said, "Is that the best you can do, Michael?" Well, I suppose from an amateur's point of view, it's all right, Michael, but don't have any illusions here that you're anything. Well, that would have been okay, but I don't need the gratification of people telling me it was all right, because the painting's the painting anyway, and the conversation I had with the painting when I did it, was all right.
Yeah.
There's a painting by Ricky Mojica in the other room, which, the sitter. What's his name?
Pedro.
Pedro.
With the hat, right?
With a hat. It's a fantastic painting, and I hope you, if this is still running, I hope you put it out for the guys. You take a shot of it. I think it's a stunning painting, and I think it's painting possibly the best thing that I've seen Ricky ever do. And he's probably, I love Ricky. He's a dear friend. He's a damn good artist. But the day he did that, it's one of those works that he knew it was a little special, and I persuaded him to part with it. We visited his studio, and I hope he doesn't regret selling it to us, but I'm very pleased he did.
I'm sure he knows it's cherished.
It's certainly cherished, and it's one of those milestone works. In some ways, he shouldn't have sold it. It's a bit like my mountain. I made him part with his mountain that day, and I feel a bit guilty about it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you asked for it back, I would give it to him.
Don't
back
invite him. He might take it off the wall.
Cut this off the thing, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. I appreciate all the insight and all the stories. Let me ask you one last question.
Sure.
What's your favorite color?
All of them.
All of them? You don't have one in your, in paint form that would be your favorite?
There's a couple. Sometimes I used to say to people it's the one I'm making today, because you have to have that love affair with each one as you make them, make love to them. Of course, I'll stack lead white because of the huge arduous process and what that stands for in terms of that textural thing that the old masters were used to. Yeah. But then again, alizarin crimson, because it's just, I mean, I know all the purists about light fastness. Oh, as you keep talking about that, but it just looks such a beautiful color.
Yeah.
If you, I think
Versatile too.
yeah, totally. I think if you love a color, that's the one you should be painting with because you'll love your work, or stand a chance. The reverse logic, of course, would be to paint with colours that you don't like, and I think we'll end up. We'd know what the painting would end up like. You won't like your painting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, often artists will say to me, "Well, which colours should I have?" With the ladies, you can normally tell because they invariably wear the colours, and they then think you're psychic because you've named magenta or yeah, and they go, "How did you know?" Because you're wearing them. Of course, guys tend to be more blandly dressed, blues, blacks, all that sort of stuff, denim and so on. So it's less easy to predict. But guys don't tend to ask that question. But I always say to artists, if you find your eye keeps on going to a tube for some reason, that's the guy.
Give it a run.
Give it a go because there's a reason why your eye's going there.
Yeah.
You're responding to it.
What about like a specific color, like pigment, like lapis or something? It's something that's unique. Anything like that?
Of course it is. I mean, I think of lapis as a bit like a gentle little old lady. She's not zingy. She's not going to poke your eye out in the way that, say, Phthalo blue will.
Yeah.
Or even ultramarine, the modern version of lapis would. But it has a gentleness, a subtlety.
Yeah.
It's not a go-getter.
Yeah, and it's expensive.
Oh yeah, but it's got that remarkable history.
Yeah.
This, my friends, is a chunk of genuine Afghan lapis. Look at that. There was a wonderful gift from my friend Mohammed, who is my pigment merchant in Afghanistan. And I hope you can see that shade blue there. Move it around a
gorgeous.
bit. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's stunning. And that's probably a good kilo. Probably 2, actually. And I suppose the burning question was how many tubes of paint could Michael Harding get out of that? Yeah, I could crush it up. I'm not going to because it's such a beautiful item. And this little pebble hair of it as well. They're just gorgeous colour. Just love the way it spins on there as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
My pleasure, Todd. Lovely talking to you.